She stood before the glass in a house that had once been hers, wearing a name that did not belong to her, watching her own face arrange itself into the careful blankness of a woman who served. The room was the green bedchamber on the second floor, the one she had always thought too cold in the mornings, the one whose curtains admitted a thin blade of early light that fell now across her collarbone and the plain gray wool of her dress. She had chosen the dress deliberately. Gray was the color of women who could be overlooked. Gray was what a companion wore when she wished to disappear, and Cecily Alderton, who had been declared dead for 33 days and had returned to London inside a borrowed name, wished very much to disappear. The household called her Miss Hester Vane. She answered to it. She had practiced in the rented room above the milliner's, standing at the cracked looking-glass and saying the syllables aloud until they settled into her mouth, as comfortably as her own had once sat there. Hester Vane. She had taken the name from the nurse who had found her at the roadside in Northamptonshire, who had kept her alive through 3 weeks of fever and bone-deep cold, and who had died of an unrelated inflammation of the lungs before Cecily's memory had fully returned. It had seemed a kind of tribute. It had also seemed practical. What she had not practiced for was the mirror. She had not practiced the particular violence of seeing her own face in Edmund's house and understanding that he did not know it. The door opened behind her. A housemaid entered with a pitcher of warm water, cast a brief incurious glance at the woman standing before the glass, and left again without a word. That, Cecily thought, was precisely the advantage of grey wool. That was precisely why she was here. She had come for a letter. It was a simple enough objective, stated plainly. The letter had been written by her own hand, in the month before her marriage had ceased to exist, and it contained everything she had learned about the Dowager Countess of Harwell, who was Edmund's mother, who had arranged a great many things in this household for a great many years, and who had arranged the coach journey that had sent Cecily north into the November cold. The letter named what she knew. The Dowager had intercepted her correspondence with Edmund during the first year of their marriage, including the private letter in which Cecily had written, carefully and without accusation, that she understood his mother disapproved of her, that she would earn approval if given time, and that she loved him in a manner she had not known how to say aloud. The Dowager had read that letter and sent no reply. The Dowager had suggested the November journey to Cecily's cousin in Northamptonshire as a gesture of familial goodwill. The coach had lost a wheel on the northern road in the dark. 2 horses had been destroyed. The coachman had broken his arm. Cecily had struck her head and lain in the ditch until the nurse found her. She did not believe the Dowager had meant for the wheel to fail. She believed only that the Dowager had watched her go and not grieved. And she believed that the letter she had written on the morning before she left, a longer and more decided letter, the one she had pressed into the hands of Agnes, her elderly maid, with instructions that it reach Edmund if she did not return before Christmas, had never arrived. Agnes had survived the accident too, shaken and bruised, and had made her own quiet way back to London, only to find that news of the death had preceded her, that the household was in mourning, and that the Dowager had received her at the servants' entrance and explained very gently that her services would no longer be required. Agnes had kept the letter. She had kept it for 33 days, while Edmund's grief did whatever it had done behind closed doors. In this house, while Cecily sat in the rented room above the milliner's, on a side street in Clerkenwell, and tried to decide what kind of woman she was. She had thought, in those early weeks, that the answer would come quickly. She had been wrong. The room was small and cold and smelled of sizing and pressed cloth, and the woman in it had a name that was not hers, and a history she could not produce in polite company, and she spent the first 2 weeks simply recovering her strength, and the 3rd week recovering her conviction that strength was worth recovering. She had gone once to the park in Mayfair in a bonnet pulled low, and stood at the corner where she could see the street on which Harwell House stood, and she had watched a footman in livery cross the pavement, and she had turned and walked away without stopping. She did not know what she had expected to feel. She felt only the cold and the weight of 33 days of not being dead, and the particular loneliness of a woman whose husband did not know she was standing 2 streets from his house. Then the Dowager had announced a new engagement, a practical arrangement, a young woman of excellent family and genuine sweetness, and the wedding date had been set for the second week of December. And Agnes had come to the rented room above the milliner's, with the letter still in her hand, and told Cecily that she had 6 weeks. If the letter came out now by Agnes's hand, or by any channel that did not carry legal weight, the dowager would deny it. She would say the servant was confused, grieving, seeking payment, and she would be believed. What Cecily needed was the letter, and the courage to deliver it herself, in her own name, in a room that contained witnesses who could not be dismissed. She had applied for the position of lady's companion to Lady Dorothea Vale, who was to be the new Countess of Harwell, and she had been engaged within the fortnight, and she had walked through the service entrance of this house 6 days ago with a trunk containing 2 gray gowns, a hairbrush, a small Bible, and the patient intention of a woman who had had 33 days to think about what she wanted to do, and had not yet decided whether she was brave enough to do it. The ivory comb was the complication she had not expected. She had owned it since her 14th year, a small thing, carved with a border of ivy, no wider than 3 fingers, purchased at a market stall in Bath by her father, who had pressed it into her hair himself because her mother was gone by then, and he did not know how else to give her something pretty. She had worn it on her wedding day. She had lost it, or thought she had lost it. In the confusion of the accident, she had mourned it in the way one mourns small things that carry a weight of meaning disproportionate to their size. On her second morning in Harwell House, she had seen Edmund Carew in the corridor outside the study, and he had been drawing on his riding gloves, and the left glove had not come on easily, and in his brief impatience he had pulled something from his breast pocket to lay on the hall table while he attended to the glove, and that something was the ivory comb. She had kept walking. She had turned the corner at the end of the corridor. She had pressed her back against the wallpaper and breathed. He had kept it. For 33 days and beyond, through the engagement to Lady Dorothea, and the ordering of new flowers, and the fitting of new clothes, Edmund Carew had kept a small ivory comb in his breast pocket, and she did not know what to do with that information except carry it in her chest like a second heartbeat. If you have ever loved someone you thought you had lost, you know the particular confusion of finding them again. If you have ever stood in a house that was once yours, wearing another woman's name, waiting for the courage to speak your own, leave a thought below. She was not yet brave. She had 6 weeks to become so. The first 3 days passed in the useful busyness of a household preparing for a wedding. Cecily attended Lady Dorothea to fittings and correspondence and the receiving of morning callers, and she learned quickly that Lady Dorothea was neither cruel nor clever but genuinely kind in the way of a young woman who had never been required to be anything else. She was 22 and had brown curls and a round, anxious face, and she was afraid of the dowager in the way all sensible people were afraid of the dowager, quietly and continuously, and without letting it show. She was also, it became clear, somewhat uncertain about the marriage itself, not opposed to it, not resigned to it with any particular bitterness, simply uncertain, in the manner of a young woman who had been told that the Earl of Harwell was a distinguished match, and had found, upon meeting him, that he was distinguished in ways she had not been warned about, which was to say he was quiet in a manner that felt dense rather than empty, and he looked at things with an attention that made a person feel they were being read rather than observed. And he had not, in Lady Dorothea's gentle experience, said anything to her that was not correct and considered and entirely without warmth. She mentioned this to Cecily on the second evening while Cecily was brushing her hair in the tentative way of a woman testing whether she was permitted to say the things she had said. Cecily set the brush aside and said, honestly, that the Earl of Harwell was a man whose warmth was not immediately visible, but that did not mean it was absent. Lady Dorothea had looked at her in the mirror with a surprised gratitude that Cecily had found difficult to hold in her peripheral vision, and they had not spoken further on the subject. Miss Vane, the dowager said on the 4th morning, in the small sitting room where she received the household accounts, you may leave us. Cecily had been arranging Lady Dorothea's letters at the writing desk. She gathered them without haste, arranged them in their packet, and withdrew to the corridor, where she stood for a moment with her hand on the door. Through the wood she heard the dowager's voice, flat and certain. She is merely a companion. She is not to be included in the family dinners." And Lady Dorothea's voice soft and conceding. "Of course, ma'am, merely a companion." The words settled on Cecily's shoulders with a familiarity she recognized. She had heard the dowager's voice carry that same dismissive ease in another form. In the first year of her marriage, when she had sat too far down the dinner table and been referred to, in a conversation she was not meant to hear, as Edmund's unfortunate choice. She went back to the letters and did not allow her face to show anything at all. It was Edmund himself who complicated the careful architecture of her invisibility. She had expected him to be remote. She had expected the man, she remembered, who had been reserved in the way of men carrying an old grief, who had kept himself at a measured distance from warmth as a matter of long habit. She had not expected him to notice her. He noticed her on the 5th morning in the library, where she had gone before breakfast to find a volume Lady Dorothea had requested. He was already there, standing at the far window with a letter in his hand that he was not reading, his gaze on the garden below where the November frost had stiffened the last of the autumn grass. He turned when she entered, and his gaze moved across her face with the same brief blankness it gave to everyone, and then it stopped, not with recognition. She would have known recognition. It stopped the way a finger stops on a word that one has read before in another book in another light and cannot quite place. "Miss Vane," he said. "My lord." She kept her voice level and her gaze below his face. "Lady Dorothea asked me to find the volume of Cowper's poems. Forgive the intrusion." He did not tell her it was no intrusion. He watched her cross to the shelves, and she felt his attention on the back of her neck, the way she had once felt it at crowded dinners, specific and deliberate, and difficult to ignore. "Have you been in London long?" he asked. "No, my lord. I came from the country." "You have the look of someone I have met." She lifted the Cowper from the shelf and turned, and gave him the steady, polite incomprehension of a woman who had never seen him before in her life. "I think you are perhaps mistaken, my lord. I am not a person one generally meets." He held her gaze a moment longer than propriety required, then looked away, back to the window in the frozen garden, and she left the library, with a book of poems in her hands, and a pulse so disordered that she stood in the corridor and pressed her palm flat against the cold plaster until it steadied. He had almost known her. She was certain of it. He had almost known her the way one almost recognizes a word, in a language one has nearly forgotten. She told herself it was an accident of resemblance. She told herself the different hairstyle, the different name, the different register of her voice, all carefully calibrated over 33 days of practice, were sufficient. She told herself she would retrieve the letter within the week and make her decision. She observed him on the following afternoon, without intending to. She had been crossing the upper hall on her way from Lady Dorothea's apartments when she heard the dowager's voice below, sharp and carrying, directed at one of the under-footmen who had, it seemed, allowed a delivery to arrive at the wrong entrance. The boy was young, no more than 17, and he stood with his chin tucked and his ears reddening. While the dowager described his inadequacy in terms that were technically polite and practically surgical, Edmund came out of the study. He did not raise his voice. He crossed the hall at a pace that was unhurried, but contained something that was not unhurried, something directed. And he said, "Ashworth, go downstairs." The footman went. Edmund turned to his mother and said very quietly, "Not in front of the staff." The dowager's back straightened by perhaps a quarter of an inch. The boy was negligent. "Then speak to Mr. Fielding, and let Mr. Fielding address it. That is why we have a steward. You have grown protective of servants since your grief." The pause before he answered was the length of a held breath. "I have grown observant," he said, "of where cruelty is unnecessary." He returned to the study. The dowager stood for a moment with her fan at precisely the angle Cecily remembered, the one that meant calculation, then descended the stairs in a manner that managed to convey that the conversation had ended on her terms. Cecily stood in the upper hall and understood, with a quiet that was almost physical, that she had been right about him. She had been right for the 18 months of their marriage, and she had wondered, in the cold of the Northamptonshire ditch and in the fever and in the rented room above the milliner's, whether the man she remembered had been a construction of her own wanting. He had not been. He was exactly as she had known him. He was a man who quietly refused what he considered unnecessary cruelty, who exercised his authority in the direction of the unprotected, who did it without audience and without announcement. She found the letter that evening. Agnes had described where the dowager kept her correspondence, and Cecily, who had been inside every room in this house when she was its mistress, knew the small writing desk in the morning room, the right-hand drawer with the key that had always stuck. She had 2 hours, while the dowager was at a dinner elsewhere, and she used the first of them. The letter was there, still sealed, never delivered, the handwriting her own, the wax cracked at the edge where someone had opened it and resealed it imperfectly. She stood in the morning room with the letter in her hands and felt the strange doubling of the moment. There was the woman she had been when she wrote it, certain and frightened and still hoping. And there was the woman she was now, who had been dead for 33 days, and was standing in a borrowed gray gown in a house she still loved, and could not make herself leave. She had what she had come for. She had the letter. She could go to a solicitor, she could present herself under her true name, she could document everything the letter contained, and she could let the law do whatever the law was capable of doing. She did not have to stay. The ivory comb was in his breast pocket, and he had almost known her face in the library, and he had said to his mother, very quietly, that he had grown observant of where cruelty was unnecessary. And she stood in the morning room for a very long time before she put the letter in the pocket of her gray gown and went upstairs. 2 days later, the dowager decided. Cecily had known it was coming. She had seen the dowager's attention settle on her across several small occasions, the way one's attention settles on an inconsistency that one cannot yet name, but that refuses to resolve into the expected shape. She had been more careful. She had been quieter. It had not been enough. The dowager came to Lady Dorothea's sitting room in the early afternoon, when Cecily was reading correspondence aloud, and she waited until Cecily reached the end of a sentence and then said pleasantly, "Miss Vane, I believe your services will not be required after this week." Lady Dorothea looked up. "Ma'am, the wedding is in a fortnight. There will be changes in the household arrangement. We shall not need a companion after that time." "Of course," Lady Dorothea said, and returned to her embroidery, and did not look at Cecily. Cecily set down the letter. She looked at the dowager, and she permitted herself for the first time in 6 days the specific quality of attention she had spent 33 days deliberately suppressing. "I understand, my lady," she said. The dowager held her gaze for a half-beat too long. Then she said, "Merely a companion, after all," with the idle lightness of a woman tidying something away, and left Cecily sat with the words on her skin and thought of 6 days. 6 days remaining. She would have to act in 6 days or not at all. The letter in her pocket was a beginning, but it was not sufficient. A letter she had produced from her own concealed person in the service of a name that was not hers would prove nothing, and would allow the dowager every advantage. What Cecily needed was a witness who knew her real name, and the only witness with that knowledge and that standing was Mr. Debley. Price, the family solicitor who had drawn up the original marriage settlement and who had attended the reading of the estate documents after her declared death, and who was, as she had discovered from Agnes, still in his chambers on Millbank. She wrote to him that evening. She wrote under her true name, and she described, in plain terms, what had occurred, and she told him where she was and what she had found, and she asked him to come. She did not tell Edmund. She had not yet decided what to tell Edmund, or how, or whether the courage for it existed anywhere inside her. She had decided only that the dowager should not be permitted to arrange things, again, in the dark. Mr. Price came on the following Thursday. She met him in the servants' parlor, which was the one room in the house where she could receive a caller without it appearing unusual, and he was a small, careful man of 60, with a gray wig and spectacles, and he looked at her for a long time without speaking. And then he said, "Lady Harwell." The title struck her like a hand at the sternum. She had not heard it in 33 days. "I need your help," she said. He listened to everything. He examined the letter, holding it carefully by its edges as a man handles a document whose legal weight he is in the process of calculating. He asked 3 questions, each precise and sequenced in the manner of a solicitor, who understands that the shape of a statement determines what can be done with it. He asked her to confirm the date of the original marriage settlement. He asked her to describe the accident as she remembered it. He asked her whether any other living person could place her at the scene and speak to her survival. Agnes, she said. Agnes could. He sat for a time without speaking, which in Mr. Trime without speaking. Price's case was not hesitation, but calculation. The careful arrangement of what could be demonstrated against what could only be asserted. Then he said that he believed there were grounds for a lawful proceeding, that the marriage had never been dissolved, but only interrupted by a presumption of death, and that the declaration of death had been made with the assistance of a sworn statement from the dowager herself, which was a matter of some legal complexity, and that he would need to speak to certain parties before he could advise her further. He would need, he said, to speak to Lord Harwell. She had known this was coming. She had been knowing it was coming for 6 days. When? She said. Tomorrow morning, said Mr. Price, if you consent. She consented. That evening she went to the library and sat for half an hour in the dark without lighting the candle. And she allowed herself to feel, for the first time since the milliner's rented room, the full weight of what she was about to do. She was about to give him information he had not asked for. She was about to disrupt an arranged engagement to a woman who had done her no wrong. She was about to ask a man who had spent 33 days in grief, whatever form that grief had taken behind these closed doors, to attend to a wife he had believed dead, who had been living in his house under a borrowed name, who had entered his household under false pretenses. She did not know what he would feel. She knew only what she felt, which was the particular ache of love sustained across a long separation and returned to a face that had not quite lost you. She knew only the ivory comb. She knew only the corridor outside the library, and the way his gaze had stopped on her face, as if searching for something it already half possessed. She went to bed. She did not sleep. In the morning, Mr. Dat. Price arrived at the front entrance. She was in the upstairs hall when she heard Fielding announce him, and heard Edmund's voice from the study, and heard the study door close. She stood in the corridor with her hands folded inside the cuffs of the gray gown, and waited. The dowager had not yet come down. Lady Dorothea was at her morning correspondence. The house was quiet in the way of a house holding its breath. 20 minutes. The study door opened. He stood in the doorway and looked up the length of the corridor, and the look on his face was one she had never seen there before, a stillness that was not his usual composure, a stillness that was the opposite of composure, everything held very carefully in place, while something beneath it. He said, "Miss Vane." She walked to the head of the stairs. She held the banister because she did not trust herself not to hold it. She looked at him. "My name," she said, "is Cecily." The breath he drew was audible in the quiet house. He came up the stairs. He came up them the way a man moves, when he is determined to reach something before he has decided what to do about it when he does. He stopped 2 steps below her, which placed them at the same height, his face level with hers, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the library, that arrested, searching quality of attention, except that this time he was not pretending not to see what he saw. "You are alive," he said. "Yes. You have been in my house 6 days." His jaw tightened in the way she remembered, the way it tightened when he was controlling something he did not wish to reveal. His hands had come to rest on the banister rail, one on each side of where her hand was. Not touching? Not quite. Why did you not tell me? It was not a question in its construction, but it had the shape of one, and she answered it as one. Because I needed evidence before I could speak. Because your mother would have denied everything, and I would have been dismissed as a fraud or a confused woman, and the letter would have disappeared. Because I was afraid. She paused. "I am still afraid. I thought you should know both things." He said nothing for a long moment. His eyes had not left her face. She had the strange sensation of being seen with an intensity that was physically warm, as if his attention gave off heat, as if she had been in cold air for 33 days and had only now stepped into a room with a fire. "The comb," he said. "I saw it. In the corridor." The second morning he reached into his breast pocket. He drew out the small ivory thing, carved with its border of ivy, and he held it between them in the space between his palm and hers, and he said very quietly, his voice level and low and absolutely certain, "I knew you. I knew you before you spoke." She took the comb from his hand. He let her take it. Their fingers crossed in the exchange with the brief gravity of a completed circuit, the warmth of it traveling up her wrist and settling somewhere in her chest that had been cold since November. She heard the dowager's door open at the far end of the corridor. Edmund turned. He turned in the manner of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it, without doubt and without delay, and he spoke before his mother had descended 3 steps. "There is someone you need to meet," he said, in the voice he used for household matters, the level voice that contained everything. "Mr. Price is in the study. You will come down. Lady Dorothea will also come down." The dowager's face underwent a brief and comprehensive rearrangement. She looked at the woman standing at the head of the stairs and looked at her son's face and understood, in the way of a woman who had arranged a great many things, that she had failed to arrange this one. "Edmund," she said. "Now, if you please." They gathered in the drawing room, all 5 of them. Edmund stood by the fireplace. The dowager took the high-backed chair she had always preferred. Lady Dorothea sat near the window. Mr. Farnham. Price arranged his papers at the writing desk. Cecily stood near the window in the gray gown with the ivory comb in her closed hand, and the letter in her pocket, and her real name spoken aloud in her own house. At last Mr. Clow. Price spoke for some time. He was clear and deliberate and unsentimental, which was what the moment required. He laid out the legal position with the precision of a man who had spent 40 years arranging other people's complicated truths into language the law could hold, and he did not apologize for the complexity of what he was laying out, because the complexity was not his doing, and he saw no advantage in pretending otherwise. The marriage had never been dissolved. The declaration of death had been issued in error, supported by the dowager's sworn statement that she herself had identified the body of a woman found some miles from the accident site. That woman, it had since emerged, was the coachman's sister, who had been traveling separately, and who had been buried in the churchyard at Daventry under a name provided by the dowager's own footman, a name that was not her own and not Cecily's, but which had served its purpose in the moment. The sworn statement was therefore false. Furthermore, the letter now held by Lady Harwell, his client, documented the interception of private correspondence between husband and wife across the preceding year, which had materially altered the conduct of that marriage. Both matters were on record, and Mr. Price had taken the precaution, on his way to Harwell House that morning, of depositing copies with a colleague. The dowager sat with her fan held at precisely the angles Cecily had seen it hold for 18 months of her married life, and did not speak. Lady Dorothea looked between Edmund and Cecily for a long time, with a face that was working through a considerable readjustment, and then she said, with the honesty of a woman who was kind enough to prefer the truth to the alternative, "I see." It was the most that could be asked of her, and Cecily felt a distinct tenderness for her in that moment, for the grace of a woman who was being required to step out of an arranged future, and was doing it with simple dignity. The dowager spoke at last. "You have made your choice," she said, not to Cecily, but to Edmund. "I made my choice 18 months ago," he said. "I was not told it was still available to me." The fan stilled. The calculation behind it was visible, for perhaps the first time in Cecily's experience, as calculation rather than authority. The dowager looked at her son for a long moment, and then she looked at the window. And something in her face settled from confidence into the quieter shape of a person who has reached the boundary of the territory her script was written for. She did not apologize. Cecily had not expected her to. She simply stood, and nodded once, and left the drawing room without addressing anyone else in it, and the sound of her departure was the sound of many arranged things ceasing to be arranged. Mr. Mittis. Price gathered his papers with the satisfaction of a man who had just completed something legally tidy. Lady Dorothea excused herself with a murmured word to Edmund that Cecily could not hear, but that carried a genuine kindness in its register, and Edmund received it with a brief incline of his head that was not unkind in return. They were alone. Edmund stood by the fireplace, and Cecily stood by the window, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was something that needed to settle before speech was the right instrument for it. He crossed to her. He stopped close enough that she could see the specific gray of his eyes, which she had missed in the way one misses light, and he looked at her face with an attention that was not searching anymore, that had found what it was looking for, and was simply resting there. "You should have told me," he said. "When you came back to London, before any of this, I know. You should have trusted that I would listen. I know that too." She looked down at the ivory comb in her palm. She could feel the carved ivy under her thumb, smooth with years of handling. She had mourned this for 33 days. He had kept it for the same 33 days in the pocket nearest his heart, and she did not know how to speak about that without breaking something open that she was not certain she could hold once open. His hand came to rest over hers. Not taking the comb, not removing her fingers from it, only covering them, the warmth of his palm against her knuckles. "I went to the roadside," he said quietly, 3 days after. "I stood there for a long time." She lifted her eyes to his. "I kept thinking," he said, "that I should have gone with you. That I had let my mother manage a journey that should have been mine to manage. That I had agreed to the arrangement too easily because it was convenient, because she assured me you wished to see your cousin, and the timing suited the house. And I did not ask you directly whether you wished to go." He paused. "I did not ask you. That is the thing I carried. Edmund, I should have asked you." "Yes," she said, because honesty between them had always mattered more than comfort. "You should have. And I should have told you what I suspected about the letters, instead of writing it in a letter for Agnes to carry, instead of being afraid of your mother's response and managing around it rather than speaking to you plainly." She steadied herself. "We were both too careful with each other in different ways." He considered this. His hand was still over hers. "Then we are agreed," he said, "that in future we speak plainly." "In future," she said, and the word opened like a window in November, cold and bright. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles with the precise formality of the period, which permitted no more, and which in its restraint managed to convey everything that a less restrained gesture could not have carried without collapsing into sentiment. She felt the warmth of it travel the length of her arm and settle. The drawing-room fire crackled in the grate. Outside the window, a light snow had begun to fall across the garden, the season's first, covering the frozen grass with a thin and quiet white. Price filed his instruments with the quiet efficiency of a man who takes satisfaction in setting things right that have been set crooked. The dowager removed herself to the dower house on the Harwell estate in Lincolnshire, which was correct procedure and which was received by those households informed of the situation as both appropriate and sufficient. She did not write to Cecily. Cecily did not expect her to. The dowager was not a woman who apologized. She was a woman who recalibrated, and the recalibration of her position with respect to the new Countess of Harwell would take longer than a season. Cecily was prepared to be patient with that process. She had learned patience in a rented room above a milliner's, and it had not left her. Lady Dorothea Vale returned to her family without public comment, and Cecily heard later from Agnes that she had accepted a different offer of marriage before the year turned, from a young clergyman of good character and genuine feeling, and that she was, by all accounts, content. Cecily hoped it was true. She thought it probably was. Agnes herself was reinstated in Harwell House, in the room she had occupied during the first year of the marriage, with an increase in her wages and a fire that was not allowed to go out. She also received from Edmund a formal acknowledgment of the service she had rendered in preserving the letter, which he delivered in person, which Agnes received with the dignified composure of a woman who had kept a considerable secret for 33 days and considered herself equal to a word of thanks. The wedding, such as it was, took place in the small chapel on the Harwell grounds in the first week of the new year, with Mr. Bake, Price, and 2 witnesses in attendance, and a vicar who had christened Edmund and who asked no questions that were not directly relevant to the ceremony. Edmund spoke his words in the level voice she had always loved, the one that derived its authority from certainty rather than volume. She spoke hers with both hands steady. Outside the chapel windows, January light fell across the stone, and the bare branches, and the last remnants of the December snow, thin and white, and extraordinarily quiet. That evening they sat by the fire in the small parlor off the library. The one that had always held the warmth the green bedchamber refused. It was a plain room, wainscoted in old oak, with 2 chairs and a worn rug and a window that looked into the garden. It had always been her favorite room in the house. She had not permitted herself to go into it while she was wearing another woman's name. She had the ivory comb. She had taken it from her pocket when they sat down, not with any design, only because she was in the habit of holding it when she thought, and Edmund had watched her turn it between her fingers for a moment, and then had said, very quietly, "Keep it." "It was mine to begin with," she said. "Yes," he said. "That is why the fire settled in the grate." Somewhere in the house, Agnes was supervising the unpacking of the trunk that had held 2 gray gowns and a hairbrush and a small Bible, and the patient intention of a woman who had not yet decided whether she was brave enough, and who had decided in the end that she was. Thank you for staying until the end of her story. If Cecily's choice moved you, we would be glad to know it in the comments below. She was not a woman who waited to be rescued. She came back on her own terms, into a house that had once been hers, and she made it hers again. The snow was still falling when they extinguished the last candle. The garden below was entirely white. The small ivory comb lay on the mantelpiece where she had set it, in the room that was finally, simply, hers.